4 months after my wife died, a repairman locked the front door of his shop, pulled down the metal security gate, and whispered, "Walter, don't go home until you hear this." In his hand was Carol's hearing aid, the same device paramedics had removed after what everyone called a massive stroke. Ernesto Vega had known my family for 15 years. I'd never seen him frightened before. He connected the device to his computer and opened an audio file someone had tried to erase. Seconds later, I heard my dead wife's voice. "Denise, something's wrong. My head," my daughter answered calmly. "Just sit down, Mom." Carol's breathing became ragged. Then I heard Denise speak to my son-in-law. "Bradley, get the phone, but don't call yet." My entire body went cold. Carol was collapsing, and our own daughter had deliberately told Bradley to wait before calling for help. Then Carol whispered my name. The recording dissolved into static. Ernesto pointed at the screen. The last 20 seconds were corrupted. Deliberately. I'm trying to recover them. Before we continue, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from today. My name is Walter. I'm 68, and Carol had been my wife for 39 years. For most of that time, I ran a delivery company in Ohio, building 2 vans into 11 trucks in a warehouse. Carol was the reason I worked that hard. She raised our daughter Denise, remembered every birthday, and kept our family together while I spent too many years chasing contracts. I paid for Denise's nursing degree, and later her wedding to Bradley, because I believed there was no better investment than family. That was why I never questioned them when Carol died. Denise and Bradley told me they'd been visiting when Carol suddenly complained of a terrible headache and collapsed in the kitchen. The doctor called it a catastrophic stroke. I accepted that explanation because my daughter had been standing beside her. But Carol had been struggling for weeks before her death, forgetting dates, repeating herself, sometimes losing simple words. The hearing aid had been meant to help her keep track of conversations when she became confused. After the funeral, I couldn't bear to touch it. It stayed in my dresser until that morning, when I finally brought it to Ernesto to have the battery replaced and casing cleaned. Instead, it had just given me the first reason to question everything I'd believed about Carol's death. My phone suddenly rang. "Denise." I forced myself to answer normally. "Dad, Bradley and I are coming by in 20 minutes, she said. "We need you to sign some paperwork about Mom's estate. Your memory has been slipping lately, and we need to make sure everything is protected." I looked at Ernesto. My daughter had just gone from telling Bradley not to call for help while her mother collapsed, to questioning my memory and asking for my signature. I didn't know yet what connected those things, but 35 years in business had taught me never to confront someone before I understood what they wanted. "Okay, sweetheart," I said softly. "I'll be ready." After hanging up, I told Ernesto to recover those missing 20 seconds and make copies somewhere nobody could reach them. Then I drove home. Before Denise arrived, I stood in front of the hallway mirror and changed everything about myself. I lowered my shoulders, slowed my movements, and let uncertainty settle across my face. If my daughter believed grief and age were stealing my mind, I would let her keep believing it. 15 minutes later, Bradley's SUV entered the driveway. Denise hurried toward me and gently took my arm. "Dad, are you feeling confused again?" I looked at the woman whose voice I'd just heard in Carol's final recording and forced myself not to show what I knew. "A little," I whispered. Denise glanced at Bradley. Then she smiled. And in that instant, I knew pretending to be weak had just become the most important performance of my life. Denise kept one hand around my elbow as she guided me toward Bradley's SUV, treating me like I might fall apart before reaching the passenger door. I let her. The more helpless I appeared, the safer they seemed to feel. Bradley watched me through the rearview mirror as we pulled away. "Dad, we need to be realistic about your situation," he said. "You're alone now. Your memory isn't what it used to be." I stared through the window as if I were struggling to follow him. "I manage fine." Denise turned in her seat. "Most days, yes. But what if you forget to pay something? What if someone convinces you to sign the wrong document?" Hearing that from the woman who had just asked me to sign paperwork made my stomach tighten, but I only nodded. Bradley continued. "You've got almost $31 million between the company sale, trusts, investments, and real estate. That's too much money to leave exposed. There it was. 31 million. Not my health. Not my grief. My money. I can still write checks, I murmured. Bradley smiled patiently. That's not the point. We want someone you trust handling things before something happens. Denise reached into a bag at her feet and poured dark tea from a thermos. I made Mom's ginger tea. It helped her when she got foggy. She handed me the cup. The mention of Carol made every muscle in my body tighten. For weeks before she died, Carol had suffered the same confusion Denise now claimed to see in me. I lifted the cup toward my mouth, but didn't drink. Beneath the ginger and honey was a faint, bitter, metallic smell. Bradley was still talking. All we're asking is for you to sign a power of attorney. It lets me handle the financial side while you focus on getting better. Power of attorney. Now I understood why they needed me to look confused. A grieving father signing away financial control might raise questions. A grieving father whose memory was failing could be presented as someone who needed saving. Bradley turned sharply to avoid a delivery truck. I let the cup slip and spilled some tea onto the rubber floor mat. Sorry, I muttered. Denise immediately took the cup from me. It's okay, Dad. I looked down. Where the liquid had pooled, the dark rubber slowly began changing color. A pale yellow-white stain spread beneath my shoe. I said nothing. Maybe it was a cleaning chemical on the mat. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. But after hearing Carol's recording, I wasn't willing to assume anything anymore. Denise wiped up the spill while Bradley kept explaining how much easier everything would become once he could manage my accounts. I leaned against the window and pretended to lose track of the conversation. Inside, I was memorizing every word. They knew the value of my estate. They wanted control of it. And Denise had just handed me the same kind of tea she associated with the period when Carol's mind had begun to fail. As Bradley drove toward an unfamiliar part of town, I watched the streets passing outside and made myself one promise. Whatever papers were waiting at the end of this drive, I would learn exactly what they wanted before I gave them a single signature. Bradley didn't take me to Harold Fitzgerald, the attorney who had handled our family's affairs for 20 years. Instead, he pulled into a tired strip mall and parked beneath a faded sign that read Merrow Legal Services. That told me almost as much as the power of attorney itself. Harold knew my finances, knew Carol's wishes, and would have asked why a healthy 68-year-old suddenly needed his son-in-law controlling millions of dollars. Apparently, Bradley preferred someone who asked fewer questions. Inside, Dennis Merrow greeted us with a damp handshake and led us to a cramped office where a stack of documents was already waiting. Just a few signatures, Mr. Walter, he said, pushing a pen toward me. I lowered my eyes to the pages and deliberately let the words blur together. What am I signing? Bradley answered before Merrow could. Exactly what we discussed. It lets me help with the finances. I picked up the pen. Denise leaned forward. Bradley stopped breathing for half a second. Then I dropped the pen and doubled over in a violent coughing fit. My glasses, I wheezed. I left them home. Bradley's jaw tightened. Dad, we can read it to you. I shook my head. Carol always said never sign something you can't read yourself. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Denise gathered the papers and forced a smile. Of course, we'll take them home. That night, she announced she was staying in the guest room because my coughing had frightened her. I knew better. Just before bed, she entered carrying another mug of ginger tea and a small white pill. Bradley spoke to someone about your memory, she said. This vitamin should help. I thanked her, placed the pill beneath my tongue, pretended to swallow, and took one careful sip of water instead of the tea. Denise remained beside the bed until she was satisfied. The moment her footsteps disappeared, I spit the pill into a napkin and poured the tea into the large ficus beside my study. Then I wiped the mug clean and went to bed. I woke before sunrise. For the first time in months, my head felt clear. The stiffness in my knees had eased. My hands were steady. I stood there flexing my fingers, realizing how long it had been since my body had felt like my own. Then I walked past the study and stopped. The ficus was dead. 12 hours earlier, its leaves had been thick and green. Now they were curled, blackened at the edges, hanging lifeless from the branches. The soil where I'd poured the tea had turned an unnatural yellow. I crouched beside it, staring. Maybe a plant wasn't scientific proof, but combined with the stained floor mat and the sudden improvement after one night without Denise's tea, it was enough to destroy the last comforting explanation I had left. My weakness wasn't simply grief. My trembling wasn't simply age. And if the tea had been part of Carol's routine before her decline, then the question was no longer whether Denise and Bradley were trying to control my money. It was how far they were willing to go to get it. Downstairs, Denise was humming while she made breakfast. I walked into the kitchen with my shoulders bent and my steps deliberately uncertain. "Morning, Daddy," she said brightly. "Feeling any better?" I let my hands shake as I reached for a chair. Not really. Relief flickered across her face before she hid it behind a sympathetic smile. I smiled weakly back. She thought whatever she'd given me was still working. I intended to keep it that way. By breakfast, I knew Denise believed the tea had done exactly what she expected. I let her watch me struggle with the coffee pot, asked where the sugar was even though it had sat in the same cabinet for 20 years, and apologized when my hand shook against the cup. Bradley arrived shortly after 9. He looked exhausted. His phone buzzed twice while Denise was making oatmeal, and both times he silenced it without answering. The third call changed him. He glanced at the screen, went pale, and stepped onto the back porch. Denise disappeared downstairs to get milk. For the first time that morning, I was alone with Bradley's briefcase. I had maybe 60 seconds. I crossed the kitchen, slipped a paperclip from the junk drawer, and worked the cheap lock until it clicked. Beneath brochures and contracts was a thick, notarized document carrying Carol's name. I opened it and felt my pulse hammer. It was an amendment to her trust, one Harold Fitzgerald, our family attorney, had never shown me. The new clause was brutally simple. If I died within 6 months of Carol, the assets that were supposed to remain protected through the charitable trusts we'd created together would instead transfer to Denise and Bradley. I read the paragraph twice. Carol had been dead 4 months. They didn't need me gone someday. They needed me gone within roughly 60 days. Suddenly, the power of attorney wasn't the whole plan. It was simply one path to the money. If they could make me appear mentally incompetent, Bradley could control my finances while I was alive. If I died before the 6-month window closed, the forged amendment could give them everything afterward. I photographed the pages with my phone, returned them exactly as I'd found them, and snapped the briefcase shut just as Bradley came through the back door. He stopped when he saw me standing beside it. "What are you doing?" The warmth was gone from his voice. I stared at him blankly. "Looking for the sugar." His eyes narrowed. "In my briefcase?" I rubbed my forehead as if embarrassed. Thought this was the cabinet. For several seconds he studied me. Then contempt replaced suspicion. "Go sit down, Walter. Denise will get it for you." I shuffled toward the hallway. Once I was out of sight, I stopped. Bradley's phone rang again. This time he answered in a whisper, but I caught enough. "I told you I'll have it." A pause. "End of the month? Fine." Denise returned upstairs as he ended the call. "Who was that?" Bradley lowered his voice. "My guy. They want the rest of what I owe by the end of the month. They're done being patient." There was a long silence. Then Denise answered in a tone I had never heard from my daughter before. No concern, no hesitation, just calculation. "The tea is working. He's getting worse every day." Bradley said something too softly for me to catch. Denise replied, "Tonight we double the dose. This will be over by the weekend." My fingers tightened around the hallway railing. I wanted to walk back into that kitchen and demand to know what they had done to Carol. Instead, I forced myself to remain still. 35 years in business had taught me that knowing someone was lying wasn't enough. Knowing someone wanted you dead wasn't enough either, not if you intended to prove it. I returned to the kitchen a minute later with the same uncertain expression. Denise placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of me and kissed my forehead. "Eat something, Daddy. You need your strength." I looked down at the food and understood the countdown clearly now. 60 days existed on paper. But Denise and Bradley weren't planning to wait 60 days. If I'd heard correctly, they intended for Walter Tillman to be dead before the weekend. I waited until Denise and Bradley left before touching anything they had given me. The mug from the night before was still beside the sink. I sealed it inside a plastic bag, scraped a sample of the yellow-stained soil from the dead ficus into another container, and wrapped the white pill Denise had called a vitamin in tissue. Then I drove across town to a private laboratory where nobody knew my family. I paid for expedited testing and gave the chemist one instruction: tell me exactly what was in those samples. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. I sat alone in a diner across the street drinking black coffee and thinking about Carol's final months. The forgotten appointments, the trembling hands, the mornings when her knees hurt so badly she needed the railing to reach the kitchen, the moments when she would stop halfway through a sentence and stare at me, terrified because the word she wanted had vanished. We had blamed grief, age, stress, anything except the people eating Sunday dinner at our table. Late that afternoon, the laboratory called me back. The chemist placed a report between us. Mr. Tillman, this isn't something anyone should be ingesting. Testing had identified a toxic heavy metal compound in the residue. Repeated exposure, he explained, could cause neurological symptoms including confusion, weakness, tremors, and cognitive decline, before eventually triggering severe organ damage or cardiac failure. I stared at the page. Could someone mistake those symptoms for dementia? Absolutely. And a sudden cardiac event? He nodded. Depending on exposure and dose. My mouth went dry. Carol hadn't simply suffered symptoms that resembled mine. She had followed the same pattern months earlier, only hers had continued until the afternoon she collapsed. I asked the question I had been avoiding since Ernesto played that recording. Would a normal autopsy necessarily find this? The chemist shook his head, not without knowing what to test for. I looked again at the report and heard Denise's voice in my memory. Don't call yet. Then Bradley's forged trust amendment. Then Denise that morning. Tonight we double the dose. For 4 months I had believed I wasn't home when Carol needed me most. Now another possibility was staring back at me from a laboratory report. Her decline may not have been natural at all. Someone may have been creating it, 1 cup, 1 dose, 1 day at a time. And after Carol died, they had started doing the same thing to me. I asked for certified copies of every result and requested that the original samples be preserved. When I stepped outside, anger hit me harder than grief ever had. Denise was my only daughter. Carol had carried her, raised her, paid for school clothes when our business could barely cover rent. Yet the evidence in my hand pointed towards something I still struggled to accept. I could have driven directly to the police. Instead, I sat behind the wheel and forced myself to think. A toxicology report proved what was in the tea. It didn't yet prove who put it there, how long Carol had been exposed, or how deeply Bradley was involved. If I confronted them now, they could destroy documents, change their story, and portray me as the confused widower they'd already been constructing. I needed the evidence tied together before they realized I was no longer drinking anything they gave me. I placed the certified report inside my jacket and started the engine. For the first time since Carol's funeral, I was no longer asking whether something terrible had happened to my wife. I was asking how to prove who had done it. And there was only one person I trusted to help me turn what I knew into something they couldn't explain away. That evening, I drove to an old warehouse near the river, instead of Harold Fitzgerald's downtown office. Harold had handled our family's legal affairs for more than 20 years, and if Denise or Bradley were watching me, a visit to him would tell them immediately that their confused old man wasn't so confused anymore. Harold arrived after dark and locked the door behind us. I placed 3 things on a folding table: photographs of the trust amendment, the laboratory report, and the white pill Denise had given me. He read everything twice before looking up. Carol never signed this amendment. I already knew the answer, but hearing him say it made the betrayal feel heavier. Harold had personally prepared Carol's estate plan. The charitable trusts were supposed to remain protected regardless of which of us died first. There was no clause transferring everything to Denise and Bradley if I died within 6 months. It's fabricated, he said, and whoever created it knew enough about the original trust to make it look convincing. I told him about Ernesto's recording, the power of attorney, the poisoned tea, and Denise's promise to double the dose. Harold's first instinct was to call the police. Then he stopped himself. If we move too early, Bradley will say you're grieving, confused, paranoid. He's already building that story. Then we find out why he's desperate enough to kill for my money. Harold made 2 calls. By midnight, his investigators were pulling corporate records, liens, loan filings, and property transactions connected to Bradley. I stayed in the warehouse drinking vending machine coffee while the picture formed. Bradley's successful contractor image was mostly theater. 18 months earlier, he had poured borrowed money into a real estate development that collapsed before completion. Instead of admitting the loss, he'd borrowed again, shifted debt between companies, and kept spending as though nothing had happened. By 2 in the morning, Harold placed the preliminary total in front of me, nearly $9 million. And these aren't ordinary bank loans, he said. Several creditors were private lenders who had already begun demanding repayment. Suddenly, Bradley's nervous phone call made sense. End of the month. He wasn't planning for some distant inheritance. He needed cash now. Harold tapped the forged amendment. If you die inside that 6-month window, this document gives them a path toward your estate. If you stay alive but they convince everyone you're incompetent, the power of attorney gives Bradley access from the other direction. I stared at the numbers. They had designed 2 roads to the same destination. Control me if I lived, inherit from me if I died. And Carol had been standing in their way before I was. Harold asked what I wanted him to do. Freeze everything? I shook my head. Not yet. Freezing my accounts would tell Bradley we knew. I needed him confident, impatient, and still believing I couldn't understand what was happening around me. Harold studied me for a moment. You're thinking like a businessman again. No, I said. I'm thinking like a father who finally understands what his daughter married and what she chose to become with him. Harold closed the file. We now knew Bradley had motive, debt, and a deadline. What we didn't have was an act involving my money that he couldn't blame on confusion, grief, or paperwork. As I drove home before sunrise, one thought stayed with me. A desperate man owing $9 million doesn't need to be chased. Put enough money where he can see it, and eventually he'll reach for it himself. By sunrise, Harold and I had stopped asking how to protect my money. We started asking how to make Bradley expose himself, trying to steal it. Freezing every account would only frighten him. Confronting him about the forged trust would give him time to destroy evidence. So Harold built something Bradley would find almost impossible to resist. He isolated $4 million from my liquid assets into a new account and prepared a narrow power of attorney, giving Bradley authority over that account alone. Nothing else. No real estate. No trusts. No access to the rest of my estate. More importantly, every movement of that money would be documented. Harold had already alerted federal investigators to the suspected fraud, and the account was being watched. All we needed was Bradley to reach for it. I went home that afternoon and returned to playing the confused widower. Bradley arrived with Denise carrying the original power of attorney papers from Merrow's office. Before he could mention them, I interrupted. 31 million feels like too much for me to understand anymore. His eyes sharpened. I pretended not to notice. Maybe we start smaller. I slid Harold's documents across the table. 4 million. You manage that for me. If it goes well, we'll talk about the rest. Bradley picked up the paperwork and read faster than a man pretending not to be excited should have. Denise rested her hand on my shoulder. Daddy, are you sure? Her voice said caution, but her eyes were fixed on the number. I trust family, I murmured. The words nearly made me sick. Bradley signed. Then he shook my hand and promised he would protect every dollar as though it were his own. That turned out to be the only honest sentence he spoke all afternoon. Less than an hour after leaving my house, the first alert reached Harold. Bradley had logged into the account. 12 minutes later, he initiated a transfer. Not 10,000, not 50,000, all $4 million. The destination was an overseas account linked through multiple entities. Harold called me while the transaction was still processing. Walter, he's moving everything. I stood in Carol's kitchen looking at the chair where she'd eaten breakfast for 39 years. Let him. Once the transfer cleared, the record was permanent. Bradley had been given limited authority to manage my money, and almost immediately he had moved the entire balance offshore. Whatever story he planned to tell later would now have to survive bank records, timestamps, authorization logs, and investigators already watching the transaction. Denise called that evening. Bradley says the account is already doing wonderfully. I almost laughed. That's good, I said weakly. Maybe he really does know better than me. She sounded relieved. They still believed I had no idea where the money had gone. After hanging up, I called Harold from the prepaid phone. Is it enough? Enough to prove what he did with the account, he said. And enough to start pulling apart where that money went. I closed my eyes. For weeks, Bradley and Denise had treated my weakness like an opportunity. Now, their greatest weakness had finally shown itself. They couldn't wait. They couldn't leave money untouched. And they couldn't imagine that the old man they were trying to poison might deliberately put $4 million within reach just to see what they would do. For the first time since hearing Carol beg for help on that recording, I felt the balance beginning to shift. Bradley thought he'd just stolen $4 million. What he'd actually taken was the bait. The afternoon after Bradley moved the $4 million, my phone buzzed with a message from Ernesto. Come now. I got the last 20 seconds. I read it twice. For weeks, those missing seconds had been sitting at the center of everything. The toxicology report told me Carol had likely been poisoned. The forged trust amendment showed Denise and Bradley needed me dead within 6 months. But I still hadn't heard what happened in the kitchen after Denise told Bradley not to call for help. I drove straight to Ernesto's shop. The open sign was already turned off when I arrived. He locked the door behind me and led me into the back room without saying a word. His face told me enough. I rebuilt the damaged section from the shadow backup, he finally said. Walter, you need to prepare yourself. He pressed play. Carol's frightened breathing filled the room again. Denise, something's wrong. I heard my daughter's voice telling her to sit down. Then came the section I'd already heard Carol struggling for air, Denise telling Bradley not to call yet, my wife whispering my name. Static crackled. This time the recording continued. Bradley's voice emerged beneath the noise, low and completely calm. Just a little longer. She's almost done. Then it's just your dad we've got to worry about. I stopped breathing. Then Denise answered. My daughter, Carol's only child. He won't suspect a thing. He never does. A few seconds later, Carol's breathing stopped. No scream, no panic, no frantic attempt to save her, just silence. Ernesto shut off the recording. I sat staring at the monitor while 39 years of marriage compressed into the final sound my wife ever made. I had spent 4 months blaming myself for being at the barber shop when Carol died. Now, I knew my absence hadn't been bad luck. It had been useful to them. Walter, Ernesto said quietly, we should take this to the police tonight. We will. But I didn't stand. I was thinking about Bradley. About the $9 million. About the $4 million he just moved offshore. About the forged amendment and the poison. And then I remembered what was happening the following evening. Bradley's 40th birthday. He had rented the country club ballroom, using money he'd once bragged came from one of his successful deals. Nearly 300 guests were expected business associates, investors, family, friends, and several of the same men Harold believed were demanding repayment from him. Bradley had spent years constructing a public image of wealth and success. He had poisoned my family behind closed doors because he believed closed doors protected him. I looked at Ernesto. Can you export the entire recording? Yes. Not just the recovered section. Everything. He studied my face, then nodded. He copied the audio onto a drive and handed it to me. I closed my fingers around it. I didn't want Bradley warned before the authorities had everything they needed. And I didn't want Denise given time to rewrite what happened in that kitchen. They had counted on Carol dying without a witness. They had forgotten the device sitting in her ear. When I returned home, I placed the drive inside my jacket beside the certified toxicology report. Tomorrow night, Bradley would stand in front of hundreds of people, expecting applause for the life he'd built. For 4 months, Denise and Bradley had controlled the story of how Carol died. Tomorrow, for the first time, Carol would tell that story herself. The next evening, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and straightened my tie with hands that hadn't trembled once all day. For months, Denise and Bradley had watched me shuffle, forget words, and struggle to hold a cup. Tonight, that man disappeared. I walked into Bradley's 40th birthday party with my shoulders straight and my eyes clear. Nearly 300 guests filled the country club ballroom. Denise saw me first. Her smile vanished. She tightened her hand around Bradley's arm and whispered something. He immediately crossed the room toward me. Dad, you look different. I feel different. His eyes searched my face. The new treatment working? Detective. Something like that. He forced a laugh and leaned closer. That $4 million account is already producing results. I told you I'd take care of everything. I nodded. He still had no idea federal investigators were following the transfer he'd sent offshore. Enjoy your birthday, Bradley. I walked away before he could ask another question. At 9, the lights dimmed. Bradley stepped onto the stage while guests raised champagne glasses. Behind him, a huge screen lit up for what everyone expected to be a family slideshow. I reached inside my jacket and pressed the remote Ernesto had given me. The first sound wasn't music, it was Carol's voice. Denise, something's wrong. My head. Bradley froze. Denise's champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. The ballroom became silent. Carol's frightened breathing filled every speaker. Then Denise's recorded voice, Bradley, get the phone, but don't call yet. People began turning toward her. Bradley rushed toward the control booth, but the recording continued. Carol whispered my name. Static crackled. Then came the 20 seconds they had tried to erase. Just a little longer, Bradley's voice said. She's almost done. Then it's just your dad we've got to worry about, Denise answered, clear enough for every person in that room to hear. He won't suspect a thing. He never does. Then Carol stopped breathing. Nobody applauded. Nobody moved. I walked onto the stage and took the microphone. 4 months ago, my wife died from what we were told was a massive stroke. I held up the certified laboratory report. After her death, my daughter began giving me the same tea Carol had been drinking, while her health deteriorated. I stopped drinking it. Within days, my mind cleared, and my strength returned. I explained that laboratory testing had identified a toxic, heavy metal compound capable of producing confusion, tremors, weakness, and eventually, cardiac failure. Then I told them about the forged trust amendment, the clause that would transfer the estate to Denise and Bradley if I died within 6 months of Carol. A murmur spread through the ballroom. They had 60 days left, I said. But apparently they didn't want to wait that long. Denise finally shouted, He's lying. He's confused. I looked directly at her. Am I? For months she'd used that word against me. Now 300 people were looking at a man standing straight, speaking clearly, holding documents she hadn't known existed. Bradley began backing toward the kitchen doors. I wasn't finished. Bradley also believed he had successfully moved $4 million of my money offshore. His face drained of color. That account was created for one reason, to see what he would do when money was placed within reach. Several men, at a nearby table, stood abruptly. Harold had identified them as people connected to Bradley's debts. Bradley looked from them to me, then toward the exit. He ran. Chairs crashed as he pushed through the crowd and slammed through the kitchen doors. He made it only a few steps into the service hallway. Federal agents were already waiting. 2 grabbed him before he reached the loading exit and forced him against the wall. Guests poured toward the ballroom doors just in time to see Bradley brought back in handcuffs. Denise screamed his name, then looked around at the hundreds of faces staring at her. For the first time, the daughter, who had always known exactly what expression to wear, had none left. Bradley twisted toward me as the agents pulled him past the stage. The confident businessman was gone. So was the devoted son-in-law. All that remained was a frightened man, watching every lie he'd built collapse in the room where he'd expected to be celebrated. And as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Denise finally understood something Bradley already knew. The recording had exposed what they did to Carol, the laboratory had exposed what they were doing to me, and the $4 million had exposed exactly why. The moment the agents pulled Bradley back into the ballroom in handcuffs, Denise stopped looking like his wife. She stepped away from him as if distance could erase everything 300 people had just heard. It was Bradley, she said. Dad, you have to believe me. He planned everything. Bradley stared at her. Denise, shut up. He made me do it, she continued, louder now. The money, the trust, the tea, it was all him. I looked at my daughter and remembered the recording. Carol gasping for breath. Denise telling Bradley not to call yet. Her voice saying I would never suspect them. Your mother asked you for help, I said. You told him to wait. Denise's face collapsed. Dad, please. I'm your daughter. Bradley suddenly pulled against the agents holding him. "Walter, listen to me. We can fix this. I'll give the money back. I'll tell them everything. Just help me." For weeks, that man had watched me tremble, helped convince people my mind was failing, and waited for me to die so he could reach my estate. Now he was calling me Dad. I let my shoulders sag slightly and gave him the same vacant expression he'd seen so many times at my kitchen table. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I'm just a confused old man, Bradley. I don't know who you are." Silence spread around us. Bradley understood immediately. So did Denise. I turned away while agents separated them. The investigation that followed lasted months. Bank records traced Bradley's offshore transfer. Forensic examination confirmed the trust amendment had been fabricated. The toxicology evidence connected the compound in my tea to the symptoms I'd experienced, while the recovered hearing aid recording became central to the investigation into Carol's death. Denise's attempt to blame everything on her husband collapsed under her own recorded words and the financial trail investigators uncovered. In the end, both received life sentences for the crimes tied to Carol's death and the attempt on mine. People sometimes ask whether watching my only daughter sentenced gave me satisfaction. It didn't. Justice isn't the same as happiness. I had lost Carol long before I understood why. And in another way, I'd lost Denise too. No prison sentence could return either of them to the people I remembered. 6 months later, the poison was finally out of my system. My hands were steady again. My thoughts were clear. I sold several investments Denise and Bradley had been so desperate to control, and used part of the estate to fund a stroke treatment and rehabilitation center in Carol's name. On opening morning, I stood beneath a simple sign, the Carol Tillman Center. I wished she could have seen it. Carol had spent her life caring for other people, and I wanted the money someone had tried to kill for, to do something they never intended save lives. I kept her hearing aid in a small box at home. I never played the recording again. I didn't need to. I remembered every second. For 39 years, Carol taught me that loving your family meant standing beside them when life became difficult. What happened after her death taught me the other half of that lesson. Loving someone does not require you to ignore what they have become. I was 68 when my daughter decided age, grief, and trust made me easy to control. She mistook patience for confusion and love for blindness. She was wrong. I couldn't save Carol that afternoon because I didn't know she needed saving. But when the truth finally reached me through the little device she'd left behind, I made sure her final voice wasn't buried with her. They wanted Carol's death to buy them $31 million. Instead, her voice took everything away from them and gave me the truth I needed to finally say goodbye.